Um, I happen to be aware that you're a Pittsburgh Steelers fan. Do you know Terry? Do you know much about Terry Bradshaw and his career?
Yeah, he was a great quarterback, and the immaculate reception is something that I think replays every single year.
Was that before you were born or something like that? Terry Bradshaw's 72 now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was in the 70s when he was in
Yeah.
his prime, I think. And so I was born in 86, if you can believe it.
So this is like, you're studying the ancient Greek Roman Empire,
Yeah, right.
Oh, I saw that on TV. Well, as you know, I've been around a little longer. I saw the Immaculate Reception when it happened. So I don't know if I can say I've known Terry Bradshaw my whole life, but I know about him a long time. What do you imagine? What's your image of him now? How do you know about him now?
Well, as a broadcaster and an actor, I guess he does movies. And he's a goofy guy. He's just like, he's kind of out there, and he's got some wisdom about football. He seems fun, but you're gonna put a different spin on that, right?
Well, there's a documentary on HBO now about him and his life, and he has a road show, and you sort of would think, well, what's Terry Bradshaw's road show about? And he goes out and he sings country songs.
Oh, that's right. I forgot he sings.
And he shows videos about his football career. And then he talks about his personal life. He's an extremely open person. And in this, it's about an hour and 20 minutes. It goes to one of his performances, in an auditorium. And I mean, before I saw this, so I know about Terry Bradshaw as an ex-football player, and I know about him as this funny guy who does pre-shows. And you just have to laugh at him, and he's completely unassuming, and he knows something about football, but he's less systematic than most of the other announcers. He'll do generally more analytic things. He's not an analytic type guy. But I was, stunned to find out that he has a gig where he goes and people pay money to hear him sing, show videos about his football career, and to talk about his personal life and to take questions from the audience. And on the documentary, they have him behind the scenes where he's somewhat more frank. And he uses the word fuck a lot. And he's completely kind of unfiltered. And so I know that Terry Bradshaw is popular. They don't pay a guy to put him on whatever football channel. People like him. But I guess I didn't realize that people would go and pay money because they feel so close to Terry Bradshaw. And so I'm sort of watching. It's almost like I'm having a dream. You know what I mean? I'm saying, Terry Bradshaw has a show about himself, and he goes around and talks to people about it. And so behind the scenes, one of the things he says about Terry Bradshaw, he says is he grew up in, I think, southern Louisiana. So he's just like a good old boy from good old Boysville. His father, I think, was a farmer. But he says very early on behind the scenes, ever since I was a young boy, I always thought I was different from other people. And they just leave it there. It's there. If I were doing an interview, there's no apparent interviewer. It's just like, let's turn Terry on and let him talk. I would say, well, how did you feel different from other people? I mean, you were just a kid. He had two brothers. They played football and messed around. How did you feel different? And then I'd ask a tricky question. I'd say, why did you feel different from other people? He doesn't say he was traumatized. He doesn't say much about his parents or how he was raised. He just says, well, we used to run around the fields a lot. And in the summer, I'll start out so that's an amazing thing he says about himself. And then he says a number, he just says all kinds of things. And then he undercuts himself. If I were a friend of his and possibly as a therapist, he says, does that make any sense? I know that sounds strange. Do you ever deal with clients who kind of undercut what they're saying? They say something and then they...
Yeah.
How do you...
Yeah, they assume that... I try to relate, I guess. I mean, I know the feeling myself when you say something and it's something that you've harbored on your own, some experience that you've had, and you try to express it, and you think there's no chance that somebody else is going to understand what I am saying here. So I guess I handle that by sort of, first of all, acknowledging it's not insane, that I understand what they're saying, and that, I've known people with similar experience, different experiences, similar lines of thinking.
I think the way I conceive of it with the life process programs, we say, well, that's a valuable way of thinking. That's, you have insights, being different, feeling different. I want to reinforce that.
Right. In the sense that it is, and to the extent that it is unique, then that's a strength. That's something you bring to the table. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's a strength and a value. And a little bit later, he says, his life is kind of unbelievable. He says, well, I've always wanted to have some kind of, he doesn't use the word meaningful, but I've always wanted to have some kind of impact in the world. And then he jumps ahead in his life. I won 4 Super Bowls, but then Joe Montana won 4 Super Bowls. And then, of course, Brady came along and won 7. So that's out the window. So what's your reaction to that statement by itself?
No, I lost track of the original statement now.
What
was the original statement?
I won 4 Super Bowls, and then I thought that was really something. But then Joe Montana, and then,
he did something extraordinary, that almost nobody can relate to, and he's still relating himself to people who are at his elite level. That's funny.
So as a therapist, we reflect back, and I say, so you're one of the top 3 guys in the history of professional football that hundreds of millions of people watch. It's sort of like
you're already in an elite category if you played in the NFL. Have you played professional football at all? If you've made the playoffs, you're in a more elite category. If you've made it to a Super Bowl, but this guy's won 4 Super Bowls. Yeah, it's
sort of like, okay, there's people win Nobel Prizes in physics, and they're not all Albert Einstein. And there's maybe, I don't know how many of them guys, certain women, 50 or 100. So it's a funny thing. It's funny how he longs for distinction and then sort of undercuts him at the same time. I'll jump to the end. He said something that almost makes you cry. He's 72 now, and he says, I wish that people loved and respected me, but I know I don't deserve it. He says that in his new healthy stage. I wish I could be loved and respected like Brady and Peyton, meaning Peyton Manning. And then he mentions Roger Staubach. And then you're going, well, you've got a show where people just come because something about you people relate to. I don't think Tom Brady, well, maybe Tom Brady could just say, okay, buy tickets, and I'm just going to sit here and show. I think, well, he could probably do that.
He could definitely do it. Yeah. But Terry Bradshaw has a shtick, and he's interesting and he's unique. That's your point, right? It's like, I think he sees himself as, maybe he imagined at one point that, I'd like to get to my pinnacle, and I'd like to be one of these people who win Super Bowls and people take me seriously. Like, wow, that was a real contender. But people see him as much more than that. The people don't only remember him for his 4 rings. They also, he's got this quirkiness. He acts in movies. He plays music. He sells out whatever stadiums now. I don't know. I didn't realize that. Just talking about his own life. And he's incapable of grasping the fact that that's, in some ways, if he had a certain attitude, that's richer than only being remembered in the Sports Hall of Fame.
He's constantly, one of the saddest things, he had people called him dog. Well, his whole life he's been sort of an underdog. He has a funny routine. He goes, well, I didn't start on my high school team in 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th, how did he get to be? But in 12th grade he started. Then he went to, he went to some off-brand school. I forget. Not Louisiana State University, Louisiana State Tech. And of all the amazing things, he didn't start the first 2 years there. There's some program on cable called, I don't know, Duck Hunters or Duck. The guy who's the chief duck guy was the starting quarterback. And you're just saying, really? That guy? That down-home guy? And Terry Bradshaw, of course, he's hilarious. He goes, Terry Bradshaw has a Louisiana accent, but he does a real Louisiana accent when he imitates that guy. And he said, well, that guy said, well, why don't we go hunt some ducks after, practice? And Terry Bradshaw, although he grew up on the farm, he said, right, that's what I'm going to do after. I mean, he was that kind of guy. And that guy didn't want to play professional football. So Terry Bradshaw, he wasn't. Here's a quiz question that this also threw me. Which quarterback did he most admire? I would never have guessed.
Which quarterback did Terry Bradshaw most admire? Give me a hint. Did it predate him or did it come after him?
For him. It's not one of the guys he loved and wanted to be loved and respected. It's a guy who was known for his style.
Go ahead. Just tell me. I'll take too long.
Joe Namath.
I'm trying to think of it.
And I'm saying Terry Namath. Okay. Most admired. That's And what does that tell you? It tells you, well, Terry Bradshaw was a down-home guy. When he first came up, he was totally awkward. He wanted to be Joe Namath. He wanted to be a guy, who was on Broadway and had a lot of dates. He wanted to come out of himself. And in a certain sense, of course, that's what his life career has been. He's still not Joe Namath, kind of smooth. But he said, when I first came up, I was afraid to talk, and I thought people would make fun of me. And I thought, people wouldn't like me. And now he still has that thing about not being loved and respected, but people love him. They respond to him and he does do his own act. And so, it sort of started to make sense to me. He wanted to be Joe Namath and that wasn't who he was. And he had to go through his career. And every time he was exposed to something new, he was out of his element. So when he got out of college, I could throw the ball, but I didn't really know what was going on. And then he had this love-hate relationship, and I want to talk about what's the matter with Terry Bradshaw is under psychiatric care. He describes he had a horrible relationship. Do you know who Chuck Noll is? Is he part of your? He was the coach of those championship teams.
Yeah, of course.
And Chuck Noll used to berate Terry Bradshaw in public. And another one of the most meaningful things about Terry Bradshaw that I related to the most in this documentary is this. I played 14 years in professional football. I never once racked a guy out in public. You know what I mean? I never once said to somebody, you missed Sill, you missed the. He never did that. And so he doesn't say a bad thing about any human being in the whole show, except he didn't like Chuck Noll. And jumping to the end, one of the things that people still put him back, when Chuck Noll died, he didn't go to his funeral. And he said, and so Terry Bradshaw, that's just one more thing people hold against me. But I didn't like him. We didn't have a good relationship. He was a brilliant football man, but that's just the way it was. I don't go to people's funerals when I don't have a relationship with them. So he had to learn how to play football. And at the same time, he talks about people always calling him dumb. And it really, really, really bothers him. And here's another thing. If I were his therapist that I would work on, he does a dumb act. And at one point in this talk, he uses a word like, he used the word premonition. And then he takes like 5 minutes to say, premonition. Do you know what that all means? And he said, and you've been to, and he does this dumb boy act. It's almost, he doesn't like people thinking him as dumb. He's not dumb. And yet he plays, there's an English phrase we don't use in America much. He plays the fool. That's his shtick.
Yeah, right.
It's
That's so interesting to me. That's so interesting that he can't get rid of that. There's a story that he had about himself that was told to him, and obviously he couldn't have fully bought into it because he was trying to prove that story about him wasn't true. And whoever he is, whatever his personality and whatever drives him, it served him so well. It's a level of competency in so many different arenas that almost nobody has, and that is not satisfying to him to remove that stain of self-doubt that he's stupid. And he even gets ahead of it and plays the fool. That's a perfect expression. Yeah.
That's a perfect summary of the entire documentary, what you just said. Because after he was a football player, he regrets that he didn't quit earlier. He mentions his father only about 2 or 3 times. You have no sense about the relationship. But he said after 14 or 12 years, I thought, you can never win in football. Because if you win the Super Bowl, if you don't win it the next year, then you're full of anxiety and everybody's putting you down. I should have quit after his 12th year. He didn't. Things went downhill. He got injured. I mean, his elbow's still not good. But his father said to him, he's a down-home boy. And his father probably said to him, they want to pay you what? Whatever. They didn't pay him $50 million like they do now, but they were paying him good money. And can you still do it? And he didn't answer the question. I would think that his father never said to him, you should try and feel what's going to make you the happiest. You probably have enough money already. So he delayed it, and then he went into broadcasting. And what you said, just as uneasy as he felt going into pro football, he felt as he's uneasy going to broadcasting. And they originally had him as a color man. He doesn't work as a color man. He's not like, one of those guys say, well, look what the guy in the backfield did. And he said, well, I can never figure out, should we focus on the runner, the quarterback, or the defense? And he sort of bombed at that too, as he originally did as a professional football player. But then Fox saw him, Fox Sports, and said, we want you for the pregame show. You're not like a play-by-play guy, somebody smart, just like Chuck Noll drafted him first. Chuck Noll, as much as he put him down, said, well, this guy could be a quarterback on a championship team. And some smart guy at Fox Broadcasting said, people like him. He's fun. Let's bring him in and let him do what he does. So exactly, he's the man who went from being a great professional football player to being a famous announcer. By the way, another telling thing, he says, I don't know many things in my life that good, but I know horses, because in the summer he worked in a horse farm. And now his life, he has a farm with horses, and he likes that, and he's good at it. One of the things he puts down about himself that he's embarrassed about, he's married and divorced 3 times. And this relates to at one point he says, I had trouble adjusting to football. It's because I have ADHD, blah, 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 but I'm not blaming it on that. And he's somebody who takes responsibility. His image of himself now is he's been in therapy. He doesn't say exactly, but he said he learned that he was depressed, which is sort of and he says, well, I learned it's about a lot of disease and all like that. He doesn't say what his therapy consists of. I'm assuming he's taking antidepressants. Yeah. But he then goes back about his marriages and he's embarrassed about them. And he says, well, the reason I got married and divorced was because of my depression. And the way it works is you're in a football season, you're in this elated high. And then after the season, you fall, whether you were successful or unsuccessful. And he would get married. His marriages didn't last for, his first marriage, he came home, said, she's a nice woman. I think he had a child with her. Maybe that was the second wife. But, it didn't last like practically a month. And he said, well, I didn't realize I was depressed. I don't exactly understand how to interpret that. You don't know that you're sad.
Right. I learned I had depression is such a funny thing to say.
And he does say, well, I learned it's a brain. And then I think his third marriage, I think was to JoJo Starbuck. And he said, well, I really admire her. She's beautiful. And she was talented on his own. That marriage lasted about 2 months because he took JoJo Starbuck, who's some kind of world figure, and he moved him onto his horse farm. And, that's not depression. That's like a lack of thinking things through. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
There were 2 months before she said, well, I'm just going to move to Hollywood. And that's hurt some.
Yeah, the horses have been nice. Yeah.
They actually have a television show where they're interviewing the two of them. And as he was already beginning to become more honest, he was saying, well, I have some problems in marriage. I have to make my own breakfast every day. And then he's on the Dinah Shore show. And she says, what do you mean you have to make your own breakfast every day? Doesn't JoJo cook? And she says, well, she might, but, she lives in Hollywood. And JoJo Starbuck's kind of, nervous being on television, exposing all of her dirty laundry. He says, well, no, I'm just in, Hollywood doing blah, blah, blah. And then they get divorced within a couple months. So he introduces his fourth wife. She's a little bit younger than him. She's very attractive. She likes being on a horse farm. And he brings her out and he says, I don't do anything without her. And then he says, oh, do you want to sing a song, honey? And she says, no. And they don't interview her either. You figure they have a behind-the-scene camera. He says he really loves his wife and he really is committed to her. And during the show, in front of the whole audience, he says, I'm never going to leave this wife and she's never going to leave me. Right, honey? And he's sort of exposing this insecurity right now. And, I'm thinking,
yeah.
God, I hope not. I mean, I'm sure who knows? She's a very attractive, blondish woman. She looks slightly like JoJo Starbuck. She's a person who appreciates horses more. I mean, they show them going around the farm on the horses and the livestock. But I guess in my own terms, I would say Terry Bradshaw, which you were describing as a person who's still at this point in his life, doesn't have an essential feeling for his own self. And that's the kind of thing that leads people often to become addicted in relationships.
Yeah.
And, he says, I don't do anything without my wife. He brings her out in the show, even though she doesn't want to sing or talk. Sometimes people form, as we've been describing an addiction, sometimes people form a lifetime dependency to something, and that works. And you can't say anything about it. But he's picked a much more appropriate spouse, obviously, than somebody who doesn't want to be on a horse farm. But it's still a matter of his whole life, an identity is wrapped around her.
It's so interesting. I used to be sort of like that to a lesser degree, and I remember being in relationships and my partners would be attracted to me and the person that I was, but the thing that was unattractive to them was my insecurity about myself, just, playing itself out. That sounds like that's something I overcame over time, but it sounds like for him, that insecurity itself is the least useful part of his personality, and so if he could kick that and form a different sort of idea about himself as somebody who's competent in several ways.
When you look at his objective life, and obviously, I mean, somebody's going to be able to say, oh, he must have been as abused as a child, but he had a good relationship with his parents. I mean, there was no obvious, his father was on his team. It's just his father wasn't able to help him. How did his father know he was going to become world famous? Another really sad moment was he was very good friends with the guy who starred in all those Smokey and the Bandit movies. Do you know who that guy is? So at one point,
what's his name? Bert.
He did a television show with him, and then the guy did a national hookup television program, and he makes fun of how stupid Terry Bradshaw is. He says, "Hey Terry, this is called a television," and he's doing this and that. And Terry Bradshaw considered the guy a friend.
Burt Reynolds. It's okay.
Burt
Sorry, I had to get
Reynolds.
that out. Okay.
And then Burt Reynolds was a little bit of a mensch. Burt Reynolds called him up the next day and said, they write that stuff for me. I don't make that stuff up. And then he invited him to come onto the set of Smokey and the Bandit. And then that became another shtick for Terry Bradshaw. He did a bunch of those. And then his most famous TV role, which he shows on video, is he appears ass naked in Failure to Launch, which stars Matthew McConaughey. And, he makes, it's a big white guy. And he shows that to his audience. And he sort of makes fun of himself. And, he's a guy who doesn't embarrass easily, at the same time that he was devastated when Burt Reynolds was making fun of him for being, he's an adult now, for being stupid again. And that all still bothers him.
You started saying this, you started mentioning this before. So if you were his therapist, what might you work on with him, or how might you approach it?
Well, obviously he's now been sold on. He does a riff. Well, I learned I was depressed, that it's a biological thing and I'm not responsible for it. We've been talking about always, let's get away from all the labels and let's just talk about your life. We're not past focusers, but I'd say, how did what did your parents think of you? I mean, did they, he thought he was exceptional. I would have explored that. Did his parents actually nurture him? Did he have a nurturing mother? He doesn't mention his mother at all, I don't think, just his father. I would try and get him to experience. He had some down moments in football. He had some down moments in announcing. He had some down moments in media. But we focus in the Life Process program on your strengths. I would say, gosh, you've come from really far down in kind of every profession you've been in. How do you do that? I myself have sometimes faced that. I wonder, could you talk to people about how you have the ability to make a comeback even after you've really been put down?
So getting his mind on the process that it took to develop all of those endpoints and skills that have made him so successful. Yeah.
It's like we do this in addiction therapy. You get a guy or a woman who has some kind of an addiction, and then they've quit some other addiction. And then I had a client once who was in a very bad, destructive relationship, and he'd quit smoking. And the way he quit smoking was one day, his daughter was 5, she came home and said, "Dad, don't you love me?" He said, "Why do you say that?" And he says, "Well, you're smoking and you're killing yourself." And then, so the way I turned that to him was I said, "What's your daughter think about this relationship you have?" So in other words, when people have already shown the strength to overcome all of these deficits in their lives, that's a life skill they have. Just
good point.
To reflect on that life skill and the values that motivated them to be able to do that. And I guess, we're not in the business of telling people, they're pointing out saying, well, what you just said is totally contradictory. But he's a person who's completely sensitive about being thought of as dumb. I would say, why do you make those jokes about not knowing words? Okay, maybe you're not the smartest guy even in the booth. There's a lot of very articulate guys, but people, how did you have the guts to do a road show where people are going to pay to come and ask you questions? I mean, you must feel that you have some kind of ability to relate to people. They like the part he wished that people loved and respected him, like Brady and Peyton. I'd say, why do you think these people come out here and listen to you? And I'd get him, I hope, to reflect on the fact that they love and respect him. They respect his variety of him. Probably there are other more articulate announcers, but he's articulate in expressing who he really is, and he's uninhibited about doing that. That's a rare quality, and it's one that he's developed over his whole life. He was totally uptight when he came, obviously, out of Southern Louisiana, and he's being upbraided, by Chuck Noll on the sideline. And then he said, at some point when I started doing that pregame show, I started saying, hell with it. I'm just going to be myself. So he's made that breakthrough, and I want him to reflect on what that liberation felt like, how he was able to do it, and what it reveals about him. How many people have been shown how much they're loved and respected as he is?
Would you say that anybody hates Terry Bradshaw? I mean, it's hard to imagine. Like somebody hating. I could see someone not liking him or having a distaste for his humor or his whole shtick. And it's funny. The thing is,
well, there's a bunch of people that come out and watch Terry Bradshaw do the show, and here I'm watching the video. I'm not a guy who's like the same page as everybody else in America. The people they're very down-home people in that audience. I'm saying, well, me and all these people all like Terry Bradshaw. I consider.
On the other hand,
sexual.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I was thinking of it this way too. Tom Brady, people generally respect him, and they respect him for a reason. I mean, he's just so skilled and just masterful. But in terms of fans of football, I'd say just as many people hate him as love him, depending on where you're from, because he's beaten all your teams. And I don't really know much about Tom Brady, so who knows what he's like in his other.
Brady, I would say to Terry Bradshaw, do you think Tom Brady has any insecurities? And maybe you think he does, but everybody, he's had Tom Brady. By the way, when he points out that Tom Brady won 7 Super Bowls, he said, but he lost 3. Terry Bradshaw never lost a Super Bowl. I'd say, what's it mean that every Super Bowl you went to, you won all of the 4 that you were in?
Yeah.
In some sense, he himself points it out. Obviously, when you're at the top of the game, you want to point, he never lost a Super Bowl. And then you can't relate to Tom Brady. Tom Brady's like a perfect icon. He's got a hair transplant. Terry Bradshaw would never get a hair transplant. He's just, and bless his soul, he's fat. Tom Brady's never going to get fat. Tom Brady's Hollywood. Terry Bradshaw has the ability to relate and open himself up in a way that Tom Brady never would. Most human beings would never do that. And I respect him for that. I admire him for that. And I'd like him to more fully, which he partially does, appreciate that about himself. What is it about you that allows you to share so openly with people? And people say that in the audience, say, well, we really are happy. And they usually put it in the point of, well, you admitted you're depressed. That's not what does it for me. He's willing to just lay out bare his good points and his bad points, to laugh at himself along with other people. That's a certain kind of a strength that I think in a way he exceeds Tom. I respect him more than I respect Tom Brady. I wouldn't go to see Tom
just as a person, I mean, who knows? You could say whatever. You make an argument as a football player. That's all I know Tom Brady as a football player. Terry Bradshaw, I think of. You asked me at the top, how do I see? What do I think about him? When I hear his name. So now that we've said all this, I think of Terry Bradshaw as a person, a very relatable, if quirky person. And you're right. All those quirks are endearing.
So if you get a chance, it's on HBO. It's unique. All right. I know you've got to carry on with your wild world travels. Good seeing you on Sunday. Glad we got a chance to chat.
You too, Stanton. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.